All right. Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the University of Minnesota Center for Transportation Studies Rural Needs Statewide Answers webinar. My name is James DeSoto, and I'm the Director of Program Development and Delivery here at the Center for Transportation Studies. Today's webinar features a presentation from Ben Winchester entitled Living in the Middle of Everywhere. But before I introduce Ben, I wanted to share some additional information. This webinar is part of our center's 2024 theme, Rural Needs Statewide Answers. Why is our annual theme rural transportation? Because mobility and transportation practices look vastly different depending on the context within which they take place. And, too often, the unique challenges and opportunities in rural transportation take a back seat to the attention given to urban and suburban issues by researchers or agencies. You can find more information about our 2024 theme at www.cts.umn.edu. We're also looking forward to audience participation and questions during Q&A time, which follows the presentation. We encourage you to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen at any time to type questions or comments for our speaker. During Q&A, you could also use the raise hand feature if you prefer. Then we can unmute you to share verbally. CTS staff member Sam Honduville is also on today's webinar, supporting the event and monitoring the Q&A. This event meets the continuing education requirements for 1.5 professional development hours and 1.5 American Institute of Certified Planners certification maintenance credits. The PDH form will be uploaded to the chat for anyone who needs it. Finally, CTS will be hosting our 2024 CTS Transportation Research Conference on November 7th. You can find more information at cts.umn.edu. But several of our sessions will have a focus on rural needs statewide answers. Now, on to our webinar. The notion that rural residents live in the middle of nowhere perpetuates a negative narrative that is not based on the reality of community life. Modern life is complex, as we live, work, shop, and play in a wide region. At the same time, most of our planning is done at a city or county level. In this webinar, rural sociologist Ben Winchester will discuss this dynamic and its implications for tourism, marketing, transportation planning, resident recruitment, and housing. He'll also review an asset-based community development exercise that can help us better understand this web of regional activity as it varies by age and interest. With that, I am pleased to welcome today's speaker. Benjamin Winchester is a rural sociologist with the Department of Community Development at University of Minnesota Extension. Ben has been working both in and for small towns across the Midwest for over 25 years. He conducts applied research on economic, social, and demographic topics surrounding the theme of rewriting the rural narrative. He recently received the International Rural Renewal Research Prize in 2021 for his work. Ben lives in St. Cloud, Minnesota, with his wife and 2 children. Ben.
Hey, James. Hi, everybody. Nice to be here, really. Thanks for your interest and your service to your communities through the work that we do. My name is Ben Winchester. I'm a rural sociologist with University Extension. I think you know Extension is like the 4-H people. I wasn't in 4-H. I'm in a different sliver of Extension called community development, and really in many ways it reflects kind of the modern society that we're in. I've got a specialty and a specialization in rural studies. It's really my wheelhouse. My undergrad was in math and stats. I went to the University of Minnesota Morris, so to the small town of Morris, from Winona to Morris. And it was there that I first kind of got involved in small town and rural life. So there's a lot I want to cover today. Really, you're going to hear the story a little bit about how this narrative gets built, and we're going to talk about why the rural narrative is important. Because if you truly believe that rural communities are dying, nobody's going to invest in that. Like, why would they spend any money on any infrastructure for small towns if we're just waiting for them to wither up and die? So we're not dying, by the way. Spoiler alert, I'm going to give you that right now. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint here. This will be something a little different. Hopefully this will be a little more consumable for you, and like, you're going to see me, right? So I call this living in the middle of everywhere, and I love this presentation. This is kind of a riff on multiple applied research projects I have. And it's a notion that I take from, we live in the middle of nowhere. So you're going to kind of hear how we've built this narrative up. And this narrative is being told about us a lot of times. And so what we see is headlines. We see newspaper articles like people keep leaving rural America. Small towns are playing a role in their own demise. From breadbasket to basket case. I mean, you couldn't have written a more disrespectful headline if you tried. right? So, and again, these are kind of the headlines that I'm trying to do this rural development work, and there's books and journal articles being told about rural, about our decline, and we're hollowing out the middle, and man, it was terrible. I used to tell my boss, like, am I just gonna like help our towns die? Like, I want to work at the Center for Small Towns here in Morris, but what kind of work do we actually do? And it was here that I realized there is a very common narrative. And it's very consistent across the country, across rural places, that there's a brain drain, right? And that is really the loss of our 18-year-olds. And when 18-year-olds graduate from high school in our rural communities, 40 to 60% of them leave. And that's typically couched as a huge problem, though your educators would never say that, right? Your kids go off to get a degree or, get a job, whatever it is, like they're successful if they leave, they're not failures. And our towns are not failures if they leave. So what we do need to know, those kids need to know, is that they've got someplace to come back to. But again, if you have a negative narrative, you believe your town is dying, why would anybody want to move back to that? We live in the middle of nowhere, you hear that quite a bit, or a sleepy town that was woken up by the blank, and then fill in the blank with like tornado or flood or sometimes murder or things, right? But again, the implication here is that you're sleeping, which isn't very helpful or indicative of what actually happens across our small towns, as you probably know. So everybody knows one another. You don't. Nobody locks their doors. You do. The lucky few escape. Like, you got to get out of here to escape and to be successful. And if even returnees that come back and move back, they're like, oh, you couldn't make it in the broader world, huh? Like, my gosh, it's terrible, the kind of this narrative. So a lot of times in our communities, this narrative is built upon what we had or don't have or wish we had or could have had at some point. But I want to kind of go back to one of the original extension people that worked on this concept for me, and this is Charles Galpin, who was a rural sociologist out of Extension in Wisconsin, and he wrote a book called Rural Life in 1918, and he was interested in how rural people define their community. And so basically what he did, which was fascinating, was he took a map of the entire region, and he would drive around, and he would go to the end of the people's driveways at the farms and see which way did the wagon wheels turn. Did they head toward Hancock, or did they head toward Morris, toward Clontarf or DeGraff? Like, which direction are those wagon wheels turning? And then he would map them out. He also did things like interviewed people, like, where do you get your local newspaper from? Where do your kids attend high school? Where do you bring your milk, right? And so to market. And it varies. Every community has a different kind of capture area in terms of what you consider within that community. And it's not always place driven. So really, for me, my own background, I've done a lot of work interviewing new people, moving to small towns. Again, our rural communities aren't dead. I'll just end this right now with the question: if you truly believe our rural communities are dying, then why can't I find a home to buy? Because we're not. And so we've been documenting this trend of people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s consistently moving into our rural communities. In fact, so many have moved in that it's filled up all of our homes. But there's other aging dynamics at work now too. So we've done studies in Nebraska, Montana, Minnesota, multiple years, and we ask all these rural newcomers, like, why did you move to this small town and rural place? And the top 3 reasons that people give is, number 1 was a simpler pace of life. And that is immediate access to recreation, getting away from a commute. You can identify like push and pull factors that are all part of this, but they're related to that kind of social aspect of households. And then you've got safety and security, which is especially high with people with children. And then the third top reason was the low cost of housing. Now, the wheelhouse here are 30 to 40-year-olds. We're not trying to get 18-year-olds to move into our rural communities. In fact, they're going to the one of 8 counties across the state. They're really not going everywhere. So we have folks moving to these communities, all these rural communities, in their 30s and 40s, sometimes into the 50s too, but that changes a little bit based upon where you're at. So we did ask people, because we typically think that the only reason people are going to move into my community is because they have a job here. And if you're an economic developer that has an industrial recruitment approach to economic development, and what I mean by that is industrial recruitment is the strategy where we need to bring in an employer. And right, when we have an employer, they create jobs, and that's going to be the reason that people move here. Well, just 41% of the newcomer households we identified in 2019, a year before the pandemic, had said they moved because they moved for a job or a job offer in that community. So again, there's these plethora of other reasons that people identify as to how they chose the region that they moved to, and ultimately they find a house in a place. But people are not just picking a town and moving to it. They are picking a triangular region and then exploring within that region. Now, Other very interesting data points here about these newcomers. Just 1 in 4 newcomer households are from that community. We tend to think a lot of times like, oh, Jim, I see your son move back into town. Like, oh, it's great to have him back, right? Well, we recognize, Jim's son because he's got a familiar name in town, a familiar face. But I will remind you that according to our research here in these other states, that 3 out of 4 newcomer households are not from that community, and they may not have the recognizable name or the social capital or the knowledge of community functions. So there's a lot of welcoming work to be done. We're not even going to really get into that here today. But we also know that just half of these newcomer households have kids. We thought that was going to be a lot higher. But again, newcomer households with children are easier to see because you could be like, oh, there's a new kid in my kid's class and there's their parent, right? But every time there's a newcomer household with kids, there's another that does not have kids. And where are they? So we also noticed that during the pandemic, the percentage of households, rural movers that said they moved because of a job went down from 40% now down to just about a third. Just a third of rural movers are moving because of a job or a job offer. And again, it makes sense. During the pandemic, you had a lot more employers, many more employers offering an opportunity for their employees to live wherever, and people took advantage of that. And we also saw, though, the percentage of people who lived in the community before went up from 1 in 4 households to now that 1/3 are from the community before. And we couldn't really figure out what happened, but then we figured it out. I will say the spoiler here is how do you move into a rural community when the housing stock is full? You have to know somebody. And who knows somebody? People that are from there and have established connections there. So it is more like, hey, Jim, I know your son is looking to move back to Hancock. Joanne's house is going to be up on the market here pretty quick. Why don't you give her a call? And then all of a sudden you give her a call and you have supper that night, and then the next day it's sold. And those are how homes were sold during the pandemic. 40 to 60% of home sales were not arm's length transactions. That is strangers selling to strangers. So this is what I document, the rural brain gain. This is a key cohort of 30, 40-year-olds, sometimes into the 50s, and this isn't even new. This has been happening since the 70s. And I've got a real interesting data point at the end here I want to share with you about some speculation as to why this may have started then. So meanwhile, as these newcomers have been moving in, we've been diversifying the rural economy. If you believe rural is a singular industry, that's not right. And what we show in extension is you're right. Like any one town is not going to have a diverse economy, but when you put 3 to 5 counties together in our rural communities, you have the same diversity in your economy that you find in the metropolitan area. So we have a diverse economy across rural Minnesota. You want to go into agriculture, we've got those jobs. Manufacturing, we've got those jobs. Truly, the largest employers in rural America today are education and health services. They make up 1/3 of all of our jobs. So if you have an antiquated notion of what rural is, I would ask you to start researching the modern, diverse economy we've got. We also found out that 21% of households that were moving in to our rural communities were telecommuting. Someone in the house was telecommuting in some way for a company not even in the region. So again, there's an idea here that there's a digital divide, but for rural communities, I'll tell you, I lived in Hancock for a long time and we had federated telephone. And they provided fiber to the farm nearly 20 years ago. So we have to be real careful about this digital divide narrative because we don't have it in many of our rural communities. And why? Because we have a super strong cooperative structure in Minnesota that gave us electricity and phone from years ago that have now invested in broadband. And we are state leaders in this country on that notion. So with this growth really has been all about regional centers. So now this has been the big shift, big box retailers and all these other regional trends. We're in a global world. And, Gillespie, we called it rural plexes at the time. Like they are regions that we have across the state. So no town is a one-stop shop. We live in these vast networks. And Dartmouth, they did all this research around mega regions, around commuting patterns and how far people are coming to commute. And in fact, when you look at the counties here in Minnesota, just 24% of people that live in Isanti County also work there. So 75% are commuting out every day of people that live there, but also they've got a big group of people coming in every day to work. So like these, and okay, I'll just keep going here. So Swift, this is super interesting. So Swift County, 47%. So now we're in the RDC region in the Upper Minnesota Valley there. And Swift County, just half of people live and work in the same county. Even Ramsey County, just 40% live there also work there, and people are commuting out to Minneapolis or Wisconsin at times, right? We know these dynamics, and I will say you all know these dynamics. Transportation, folks, You all have had this data, I will say, for decades on road traffic counts, directions, but it's been nearly impossible to interpret. Like, this is one of the best ways for me to help explain a concept like the middle of everywhere is by using your transportation data. But here it's solely related to employment and the direction that they're going. There's more detailed maps you can get here. It's called On the Map, the census puts together. So anyway, we'll look at Redwood County. Again, this is in the Southwest RDC region. Just 50% in Redwood County live and work there. Martin County in Region 9, 59% of people that live there also work there. So we are crossing these jurisdictional boundaries all the time. We just updated our data with Catherine Lays here in Extension, and just 48% of Minnesotans work in the county that they live in. So again, they're county boundaries. What do they even mean today? I'll remind you that these boundaries were drawn during a time of horse and buggy. They don't reflect some natural delineation of how people live or work or anything. It might be a lake or something. So meanwhile, now when you look at, what do regions mean? Like here, look at Thief River Falls in Northwest. Like there, you've got to drive to work. They've got buses bringing people in, right? You know some of these numbers of employees that are coming in from the outside to this region, and we see them reflected in transportation. But sometimes they're having to adapt transportation methods like buses. But I will give you a new insight here, I believe, which is right now we're seeing a ton of pressure around lodging. And when I say that, I mean, we have a workforce housing shortage across rural America. It's been around for 15 years, folks. This isn't new. This workforce housing shortage is many ways reflected as a labor shortage, but labor shortage is not the lack of interest. It's a lack of a home for labor to live in. So what we're seeing now, though, is in some circumstances, lodging, and when I say lodging, I mean hotel and motels, are now being filled up with a workforce. And why is that? Because the cost of housing is about the same when you're going to be in a full-time motel for a month at a time, and you're doing month-to-month contracts. It's much more effective for the local motel owner to deal with the sporadicness of tourism. But what does this impact? This impacts tourism, because now we're finding that the tourists are heading up to the region. They're finding all the lodging is full because it's full with laborers. So we're now starting to see the issues of workforce start to impact our tourism. So I would get asked this question like all the time, like, hey, if there's all these new people to our rural communities, where are they? They're not part of my groups. Like, I think community life is dying. And I was like, it's not really dying. Let's just look at this for a moment. And when you do look at the types of groups that people get involved with, it tends to be religion related, right? This is number one in almost every state in the country, parts of churches, right? But then two, recreation, sports, leisure, third largest industry for nonprofits, and where people spend their time socially are education, community improvement, arts, culture, these things. But a lot of times when the established population in the community does not see these newcomers, they believe they're not involved, when in fact we know that these newcomers are involved. In fact, 56% of all the nonprofits in Minnesota have been created in the past 30 years. And what kind of groups are they? They're recreation, sports, leisure, regional groups, education institution related to school districts, which cross all these jurisdictional boundaries too, right? Arts, culture, humanities, like Arts Meander Group, that covers a whole region in Western Minnesota. Human service. So the idea here is that this new population is moving in and they're capitalizing their ideas and their support of building nonprofits and building their social ends. But there's a tension right now because there's a shift in how people want to be involved. And if there's a takeaway on the social side, it's this, and there's implications for travel here too. And that is how people used to be involved would be very place-based with a narrow geography, but the group would have a broad focus. It'd be like, oh, the Hancock Community Betterment Club, right? It just served Hancock. But they would do anything. They would help, put something up at the school. They would help build a senior center. They would raise money for whatever in town. Narrow geography, broad focus. But today, people want to be involved in just the opposite. Rather than a narrow geography, it's a broad geography. Rather than a narrow focus, rather than a broad focus, it's a narrow focus. So the example would be like the West Central Minnesota Bicycle Association. Like, it doesn't just exist in one town anymore. The people that are being served by it are regional. It's 14 counties big. They're biking all over. They're running to Cuyuna from Morris. Like, these are huge regions that people are now engaging in terms of the social aspects of human life. So here I would make the argument that, we're living in regional communities. We don't live in the middle of nowhere. We live in the middle of everywhere. And we put our home at the center. So we actually do an exercise. We call it the living in the middle of everywhere exercise. And what you do is you hand out a map of a region. This works best when you're in a community of place. So say you're in Morris, and we start to add, we draw a map around Morris, and we ask people to put a star where you live and an X where you work, and then draw a circle around here. I'm going to do this quick. So here is the Morris area. We lived in Hancock, and I worked in Morris. So put a star where you live and an X where you work. And right again, like the decoupling of home and work, like home and work are decoupling, consistently decoupling year after year. So these are becoming spatially separated. But then when you ask people to draw a boundary of in the past year, how far have you gone to shop and eat out? And it's huge. So now you're getting up to 45 minutes out, but we really didn't go to the west all that much. We pretty much went southeast, and depending upon where you're at, this map is going to look different. But then the next piece of this puzzle is on this map. You ask people to identify how far have you gone in the past year to play. It's cut off here, but play and recreate. And so now you're getting into the work-life balance. Then you're getting into the shop and some of those necessities balance. And now you're getting into the social and recreational pieces. And now it's like we go to Canada. Right? It's a huge area that we live in. So what you end up doing out of this is you end up collecting a lot of super interesting data that gives you a ton of information. So imagine now you did this with 100 people. Now also, as a part of this exercise, in the top left corner, you ask people to list their age. And so sometimes people don't want to give their age. So I just say, just put your 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s or whatever, right? And then in the other corner is list 3 to 5 of your favorite assets in this region. And it can be a park, it can be a school, it can be whatever it is, but it can't be something nebulous like hardworking people, okay? Which plenty of people have tried to use that in this exercise. These are real things. So like if you were to see a newcomer on the street and they were like, hey, what's fun to do around here? This is what you refer to, right? So now imagine, and we've done this, imagine you have 100 of these. We have a community dinner, we hand out this exercise from the community, and you start to see how big of a region people live in. And here's how we do that. You collect, have them complete all these exercises, and then we sort them around the room by age. And what you notice is that people, as they get in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, like as you get older into that middle age, like 40, 50, 60s, like your region gets bigger, and then it starts to shrink as you get 70, 80, 90, and then your dot goes away, right? But the idea here is that, boy, we have a great interrelationship with all of these other places around me. And if I'm really truly going to explain how people live, I can't just use our counties. I can't just use our cities. Like we are not the be all end all. So number one, you see that trend of 30 to 70-year-olds of the regions getting bigger and then contracting back in. The other thing you see, though, is related to the assets. And that is the assets that the 30-year-olds are identifying are vastly different than the assets that the 70-year-olds are identifying in the region. So there's a whole different kind of issue around marketing and how do you explain like, hey, what's fun to do around here to a 30-year-old when I'm 60? I'm not 60 yet, but like how do you do that? And how do you respect people where they're at rather than just naming off the stuff you know? We're not trying to build my community always. I selfishly would love to do that, but we're trying to help people build theirs, because when you help people build their community, you have a retention capitalization. You are totally doing great because you are able to welcome in people and retain them. We do know that a welcoming experience in a rural community leads to a higher percentage of households saying they're going to be there in 5 years. Full on 86% of newcomer households that said the community was welcoming say they're going to be there in 5 years. But just 44% of those now that said the community was not welcoming say they're going to be there in 5 years. So again, your community matters. How you do welcoming work matters. So again, like I have some directions for this. If you ever want to do this exercise locally, let me know. I'll easily help you put this together. It takes no time at all. Super powerful and interesting. Leads to lots of conversations like, oh, I didn't know there's a new brewery that opened like 2 counties over or whatever. Like any of these things are super interesting to me. I hope they're interesting to you, right? So again, I've done this in a number of places here, just examples of like kind of regions people put. But again, nobody is just drawing a dot. Nobody is just drawing even a circle around the county. These go into vastly different places and different regions. So really, no town is a one-stop shop. Between home and work is 30 to 45 minutes. Between home and eating and shopping in the past year is up to an hour out. And again, you guys probably know some of this. And home and play is up to 2 hours out. Like, what did the traffic patterns look like on Saturday morning or Sunday afternoon coming into the cities or going out? What do those traffic patterns look like and where do they branch and all that kind of super interesting stuff. So interesting for me. So really, how do you help local people make a decision when they're working in these jurisdictions, but nobody lives and works and shops and plays in these jurisdictions? Like, the region is the primary unit of analysis. So like, how do you even talk about your places when you're trying to make the region worthwhile to people? So, but again, if you're parochial and you're like, oh no, hey, James, I know you're looking at moving to Hancock here, and we love this town. We have it all going on. You're going to love it. And then you're like, oh, I'm going to also looking at moving to Benson, I think. And I'll be like, oh, you don't want to move to Benson. They got nothing going on there. Like, you really do live in the middle of nowhere then, right? Because what did you not only did you downplay what they have, but you downplayed anything around you. If you can't talk positively about what you actually have around you, like, you're going to be in trouble. So meanwhile, that's the regionality of rural life. And what are the implications here? Like, for something as simple as that middle of everywhere exercise, there's implications for marketing, transportation planning, employee and resident recruitment, for housing. And again, I kind of already say, like, you already knew some of this. Only right now, I think there's a lot of new tools to help communicate and engage the public. The census on the map, you saw the, commuting patterns with the on the map. I love that. It's a basic tool I use. It's not the end all be all for me, but it's something to help engage communities in the conversation about what's our role in the region. But even more so now, and we've got access to these in our extension office, and we've got some people looking into these, like Placer.io. It's using cell phone data and identifying, like, hey, where do people go if once they get done watching the hockey game, where do they go after that? And you can do pathing and sequencing. You can see how far people are coming from. So basically, these on the map maps without asking people. In a sense, I mean, if you're afraid of how much cell phone data is known about you, then maybe don't look into this tool any further, because all this data is out there. So there's this other types of mobility, and Placer.io is just one of these kind of packages out there. So there is a ton of change coming in our rural communities. Like right now, 30% of our rural homeowners are over the age of 70, and another 45% are like baby boomers, or really 75 at this point. So like 75% of our homes are owned by baby boomers and older. So where are we? So here's where we are, in my view, in our rural communities. Right now, our housing is full. Right now, we have a labor shortage, which again, for me, is a housing shortage. But we were calling for the grain of rural like 25 years ago, and it was the grain of rural 25 years ago. And then typically, demographically, we were waiting for people to retire, because historically, if you look at this, historically, once people retire, the green line here, the bottom line here, once people retire at this age, they start moving out of home ownership. All previous generations would move out of home ownership. But this cohort today, they're staying in their homes. And why is that? Not solely because they want to. Like, actually 20 to 30% of households would want to move out. The issue is all the move over housing was filled in the 90s and the 2000s. So the generation retiring today, just at the upswing of the whole baby boomer retirement, they retired and looked around and said, oh, I guess I don't have anywhere to move over to, so I'll just stay in my home. And which home are they in? The family home, the workforce home, the 4-bedroom, 3-bath, 2-bath place that normally would have been churned out into a new generation moving in. We call it the churn of housing. It's moving in, moving out, and moving over. And so right now, this churn of housing has been extremely slowed by the inability of a portion of these older people to move over. And when they can't, and I'm not talking about assisted living here, folks. I have a whole nother presentation on this. This is a continuum of life before you get to your continuum of care. These are patio homes, independent living things, right? You want to go visit the grandkids or whatever. So this one chart really explains a lot. But at the same time, like 58% of older adults have not changed residence in more than 20 years. And in fact, we have a whole aging in place industry that's dedicated to helping people stay in their house. But I would, and I do, make this argument that age in place should not mean age in your house. Age in place to most people actually refers to staying in their community, because when they do have to move out of their home, it's usually an emergency mode. And then they find out they don't have any control, they don't have any choice, and they're now 2 towns over. But meanwhile, we have an entire industry right now that I say many times just aging in your current house, which is perceived as being cheaper. Like, I'm not going to take on a new house loan. Why would I? This one's paid off. You can shift your equity. There's all these conversations to be had. But actually, there is an entire age-in-place industry that is now incentivized to keep people in their homes. In fact, I would argue that bringing people there, taking people to their medical appointments, is bringing them their meals, their medicine, like maybe those should be built environment factors that are in closer proximity, because right now we are incentivizing keeping people in their homes. Like, I'm going to bring you your meals, and I'm in no way and trying to dissuade you from doing the good things here. I'm just kind of prodding the conversation about right now how many resources are dedicated to keeping people in their homes, and which homes are they? They're in the workforce homes. Like, oh, the bathroom upstairs doesn't work, but that's fine because I don't go upstairs anymore. We actually have to be concerned over our housing stocks moving forward. That's not the point of this webinar. This is all about, we do have people moving in, and every time a home gets sold, gets put on the market, it is sold almost immediately, even today. So really, moving over for us does open up the opportunity. So we offer move over housing. Otter Tail County has done this. New London's, like all of these communities we have, and it's episodic. Housing does not get built where you wish for it. Housing gets built where there's income, or there's a builder in town that actually right? And so we've seen this, like, again, Otter Tail County, there was a builder up there who was like, yeah, I didn't really know about this kind of move over thing. So I put up these 4 patio homes, and they were 2 2-bedroom and 2 1-bedroom. And then those sold the moment I broke ground. So I put up 4 more. He was not super happy that the housing studies really don't talk about this. So really, it's just engaging your community in a conversation about the future of its housing stock, because right now seniors have a policy of best intentions, and that is, I'm going to live in my house forever. And when they do spend a lot of money investing in living in their home, they do things like put on a ramp or update the bathroom with wider doorways and bars, safety bars and things. But then what happens in like a year and a half? Like, my mom had to move out, and the real estate agent was like, we would love to sell your mom's place, but you got knob and tube wiring, and you're gonna have to replace that. And peeling paint, and there's no first-time home buyer eligibility for peeling paint, so we got to paint the house. And then my mom's like, I just spent $15,000 on the ramp and the bathroom stuff, right? That's not an equity builder. That is a pure livability expense. So I just, again, want to prod the thinking around the investments or the spending we are making around around this age in place, and where could we be dedicating those resources potentially? Because when we do provide the move over housing, it fills up right away. Ask any of these communities that have done it. So, which again opens up that workforce housing. So now, what do we know? I mentioned more recently that the grain of rural from 20 years ago, right? The grain of rural from 25 years ago is now the dying of rural. And demographically, you have to talk about this, but through death brings rebirth. So really what happens in these housing substitutions, and we've seen this in Minnesota, the State of Rural report in the bottom left here by the Center for Rural Policy and Development, what they found is that in the most rural counties in Minnesota that have the highest death rate, they now have the highest in-migration rate. And why is that? It's because it is literally the slow trickle of people out of these housing units, and then 3 to 5 people are moving in. So imagine, again, 75% of your homes that are owned by baby boomers and older turning over in the next 25 years. And we're out with 1 and 2 person households and in with 3 to 5. Half of those newcomer households have kids. I don't want to be called Pollyannish because I've got data behind me that tells me these substitutions are happening. Rural communities are in high demand. Change is coming. But again, if you have a narrative that your community is dying, nobody is going to invest in that. So for me, rural is durable. We're still here. We're totally desirable. Housing is full, and the pandemic only shone the light on the desire for people to live in less dense environments. We're engaging. Our nonprofit groups are growing. People are actively involved, and we're diversifying demographically and economically. It's very slow, but it's happening and has been happening. So I thought I'd share with you all. I dug into my files. I will say that from a transportation point of view, if you wanted one data point to estimate population growth in our rural communities, it's the price of fuel. If you look back on the price of gasoline, so I did this at a big spike, which actually we had rural. my point here is gas was actually quite expensive, relatively speaking, until about the 70s, right? And there was a hit there too. Everybody remembers oil embargo and some other things. In the 80s, it was high. Where were the periods of rural in-migration? It was the 70s, the 90s, and the 2000s. And then it slowed. The price of fuel, once it's below $1.60 controlled, and this was again in 2006 when I made this, but there seems to be a direct and inverse relationship between the price of fuel and rural migration. Fuel was actually quite expensive for the first, like, look at that. I mean, quite expensive. So if you, I mean, especially with the cost of a vehicle, even like it wasn't very inexpensive to run a vehicle. It was still somewhat cheaper than it is now. But really that became an interesting point for me. But I will say the number one thing for me is the key challenges that we've got are planning around these jurisdictions. You know, we've got county goals to do things, but what about upstream? What about downstream things that are happening that can impact us? And the friction with how people actually live. So like we're trying to create jobs at the county level. Well, is it okay if like people just live here and have the job next door? Because this is just a web of how people live and work and shop and play. So I'll end this part here with, you know, people are making a choice and have been since the 70s. These newcomers are moving into our rural communities. They're creating groups, they're building their community, diversifying the economy, buying and starting businesses, working from home, living in this huge region. And they're certainly more than warm bodies. And what I mean by that is we actually have to get to know who these people are. Like we want to succeed our businesses, our leadership positions. We have to respect them on the terms that they come here with and the energies that they expend, because there are some really great reasons why people are moving in, and not everybody hears that. So again, we need to open these new doors. And the bottom line is people want to move and live in your towns for what you are today and what you're going to be, not what may have been. Like I'll remind you that like I've done all these interviews and focus groups, and nobody, you know, you have this negative narrative out there that my best days are behind us. Nobody wants to live here. Like nobody ever said they're moving to your town for pity. Like, oh, Appleton, I feel really bad. Prison closed like whatever years ago now, 10, 15 years ago. Like I'm going to move in and help you guys out. Like nobody says that. Like people are moving in despite all of these major structural challenges around globalization, around school consolidations, around closures of fill in the blank. But we are still highly desirable. And there are people waiting in line to move into our rural communities. So I just want to say thanks, really, for your interest, for your service to your community in this area. I'm happy to be here and to provide this type of applied research view of where rural America is, especially through this transportation lens. But I mean, at the heart of everything rural is transportation. And there's a different view of like distance from East Coasters to here, like 3-hour drive here to northern Minnesota, no big deal. I'm not even in northern Minnesota. That just gets me to the center part of the state, right? Anyway, we have a huge state. Transportation is at the heart of our rural communities. So again, the implications for me are fairly obvious. Like if you're not paying a lot of money to your employees, you better ensure you have a mechanic on hand so they can get to work every day, right? They have some type of social access to those things that are going to help you survive socially in economic systems that may undercut them in some ways. So I'm going to stop the presentation here. I know I'm going to send this PowerPoint out so you all have a copy of this. And I'm happy to help generate maps or generate exercises if you're interested in doing that. This is fairly straightforward to do. It's just a real pleasure to share a lot of this research and share some of the perspectives around welcoming that we've got for our rural communities. So James, back to you, and open for questions too. Oh, I guess there are some.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. As a quick reminder, please put any questions that you might have into the Q&A. However, if you would rather enter into a dialogue with Ben, you can also raise your hand, and I believe we can unmute you so that you can ask your question directly. But Ben, your choice. Would you like to just answer directly from the Q&As, or would you like me to read the questions?
I see the Q&A. I'll just read it and then respond here. Yeah,
wonderful.
I didn't see it at first. Here we go. So a question from Natalie. Did you collect data on how long these newcomers stay? Nope, we did not. We did not go in later and do follow-up with them. Our forward-looking question really was around the welcoming. Did they feel welcoming here? And then our forward-looking question was around, do you expect to be here in 5 years? And it really was indicative of whether how it was going so far. And do you think the modern diverse economy is Minnesota specific? Not at all. This is all across rural America. Our industries are super diverse. The Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank does all these studies around eds and meds, and it does. It talks about the importance of healthcare, the importance of our educational institutions in our rural communities. And that, again, if you've got, I mean, it depends upon your perspective, right? If you're a county commissioner, you might think agriculture drives the economy. If you're in town, you might think it has nothing to do with it. I think there are a lot of competing interests around how things get defined. But for me, I'm a non-agricultural rural sociologist. Like 95% of rural people are not engaged in ag or an ag-related field. So I'm here to talk about like rural is more diverse than ever, and it looks different. It's just not the same place our grandparents had. So that's what I got here. Let's see. What do jurisdictional boundaries mean? Court. Yeah, the coordination amongst these jurisdictions. Yeah, I mean, we see it depends upon what jurisdiction you're at. We see counties work together around like mental health services and transportation sometimes, but when it comes to jails, like they all want to be the home for the jail. Like they want to have it in their town. So I think there's a lot of it depends upon what the topic is and what region of the state you're in that would dictate how well they work together. I mean, we have had groups like the Western Area City County Cooperative Group, WACO is what they're called. They used to do all collaborative purchasing for, and used to, and still does, I'm sure. But there's groups that do collaborative purchasing among public agencies to try to get some economies of scale. So I think there are opportunities to work with that, but it's not in the inherent nature of these jurisdictions to have to cross these boundaries. So we actually have to work at developing those structures or modifying how we actually do that work. Given the extensive travel that people appear willing to engage in for work, shopping, recreation, how can transportation serve people that are not able to drive? Is this a transportation issue or housing and economic development? I mean, these are the broader general trends of life that have many ways forced our hand to live in these regional communities. When we close up shops in certain towns, we have to get those economic aspects of our life somewhere. And they tend to be in our regional hubs right now. And Minnesota, we're actually lucky to have so many regional hubs across the state, not like other states. So it becomes very interesting to talk about that, that topic. But for those that cannot drive, we do have infrastructures across some rural communities. It is not my wheelhouse. Transportation, again, is not my wheelhouse. I just look at some of the data about how people live, but the systems are not built for it. I mean, we used to, I was just talking on the pre-call here, like David Stringer used to do all this work for the local service airlines, and that was seen as a stepping point for business development. Like when we had finally had these regional airlines, we could serve more of these less populous communities. So I think we're always trying to alleviate some of these concerns that globalization is totally driving with the dynamics around how people actually live and the incomes that they make. There's going to be no shortage of work in that area. It's not something that's inherently going to be solved because it may be inherent in the system that we've got. So, have you compared the exercise rural versus urban? Yeah, rural urban people too. If they're getting out and about, even rural urban people don't work in the city they live in, right? They're always moving around. It's just they have a much more populous area and a smaller place with the people. So, for the data you're referring to, are they only using the true data, or are they multiplying it for a larger sample? I'm not sure what that means. Natalie, if you could expand on that. Mark Schaefer, not a question, okay, not a question, but a statement. I really appreciate the presentation. Insightful, give me a fresh outlook on rural. I'm guilty of having a negative outlook. It's okay. Again, this is the role you have matters. The view you have about rural matters. It's what you expound to your kids. It's what you expound to your community members. And more importantly, like for me, an extension, like we can't have people in extension talking like our towns are dying and we're going to help you die. Like you're not. Like, how do we ensure that our communities are places that people want to live in today and in the future? So your narrative can dictate all the strategies you take, but more importantly, if you truly believe we're dying, nobody's going to invest in us. So having an accurate narrative matters. Let's see. With EV and more investment in support infrastructure, do you anticipate changes the influence of your gasoline charge? Yeah, I mean, it's getting to the point where we're starting to see more opportunity for the battery system to keep us away from that kind of centralized system. So we'll see how that works out. I am very interested in it. We've got colleagues that are doing a lot of research about it in our center too. So this is one of the major influence that we're starting to see, like the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to start to see investments pour out through some of these projects. So we got a lot of things things changing and a lot of investments being made in a really nice way for our rural communities. So thanks for that. The cell phone data, Natalie, generate larger data size by taking the same person multiplying. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's why we have been triangulating. There are some issues with data quality. But for me, I'm very careful, like with census data now, especially the 2020 census data is very questionable. And the ACS, the American Community Survey data, is only used to explore trends over time. So we don't have really good counts on things anymore. So even like cell phone data isn't about counts, but you can look at trends. And that's, again, what I use census data for. Like I'm not going to use census data to give me the number of housing units because I don't trust those numbers right now. For whatever reason, I'll have another conversation. I've met with many state demographers and assessors over all this data. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So be careful with your decennial census data if you're using it and putting it into your reports, your transportation studies. Like, be extremely careful about this. I live in a little town, see no revitalization. Downtown's dead, right? Like, I will say it. So in the fuller rural narrative presentation I give, I do talk about, like, we have gone through all these dramatic changes. We're closing hardware stores and grocery stores, right? Like Hancock, we closed our bank, and like the grocery store. Like, it's easy to think your town is dying, but I will tell you that that's been the pattern across rural small towns across this country. So do not let the negative visuals make you believe this town is dying, because people are still choosing to move into these communities despite these changes that you've seen. But it is like, I drive past there's where the bank used to be, and that's where the grocery store used to be. Like, it's easy to think your town is dying when you look around. But there are still highly desirable places. We're not brick and mortar. Do not let the visuals confuse you. Your towns are still extremely desirable, highly energetic. It's just not concentrated like urban centers are, where you can see it, especially when the social and economic activity happens over 5 counties rather than just one community or one neighborhood. But again, that's why I would go into that Gillespie work earlier about spatially separated neighborhoods, seeing rural communities as like a huge neighborhood, and then you find those same dynamics. But again, we tend to be driven by an urban industry, so I'm always trying to make these arguments that rural is actually desirable, when I would actually make the argument that rural is the piece that's desirable. It's why you have suburbs. People did not want to live in the cities. They created the first ring suburbs. And then the 70s, 80s, and 90s, people didn't want to live in the cities. And they looked out to the first ring suburbs, and they're like, don't want to live in the city. And they created the second ring suburbs. In fact, all of the metropolitan growth across the United States since 1974 happened at the expense of rural communities being transitioned to urban. So our urban communities have grown wider, not taller. So there's another urban idealism fact for you. I try to battle this narrative against all the time. So, other questions? Sorry, I'm trying to track like chat and other things here. Housing. It's all about housing. The housing presentation I give is easily the #1 requested presentation I give. Because it's like taking that move over slide and the percentage of seniors not moving over. That right there is an hour-and-a-half community conversation about what are the intentions of folks in town, what's the condition of those homes, ton of community engagement work to be done. But that's not really in the wheelhouse of what we're talking about here today. Other questions? Again, make sure to get the PowerPoint to you. If you've got questions about my data sources, feel free to email me. I'm happy to entertain any questions you've got. If you want to see on the map for any county you work in or any city you work in, it just helps, engage a conversation really about, what our communities look like today is the general question. Transportation is my lens. Where people go.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. Probably last call here for any remaining questions that people might have. You can either raise your hand or enter something in the Q&A. All right, well, thank you so much, Ben. Really a fantastic presentation, very thought-provoking. I know some of our attendees raised that exact point, but again, the reframing and how you look at rural communities and the transportation lens that you brought to that as well, I think was incredibly helpful and incredibly interesting. So again, my thanks from the center. And for those of you online, this will eventually be posted on our website, as well as the PDF of the slides themselves. Give us some time to get that up and running, but you can look forward to that in the future.
I do see one more question there, James. The conversation about my community is dying is really sometimes a negative view about my community is changing. Totally. You hear it in conversations like, oh, when are these new people going to learn how we do it around here? Like there's a perspective I've got here. And that is, do you believe your community is a melting pot or is your community a stew? I kind of work from the stew perspective that we have consistently had people moving in and moving out of our communities for decades. In fact, there's a book called The Lies of the Land by Stephen Kahn, who would argue there is no community that you're melting into. In fact, there never was, especially in America. Like, where communities are not that old. All we have is like generations of people that had some similarities. And right now, it's very different. And I kind of make the point that, yeah, our communities are changing just like they did when the Swedes moved in and you're wondering what they're doing here. The Protestants moved into your Catholic town. Like all of these changes have happened before, but right now it's much more visual. There is some NIMBYism out of any of those. There are people that want to shut the door when they move in kind of stuff. But it really is like fascinating to look at how people talk about the town as a melting pot or a stew. And then again, the implication here is that is there a singular culture that people have to just melt into that, or are we allowing new people to actually like leave their mark on our community? And I'm the latter. I'm always just trying to get the lift up the voices of newcomers. They have generally the same values. You're not different all that much. We have the same interest in stewardship and caring for people. Like it is our lives have very similar values around them. So as long as you don't start from a divisive, top level conversation and you talk about what you like about your town, there are a lot of things that you can talk about. So I appreciate that comment a lot. For me, I do like to engage our older senior population. I shouldn't say senior, people over the age of 55, to remind them that there's people waiting to move in, that we want some continuity here. Like this was the community you raised your family in. We want this to be the community that the next generation is moving into because they actually want to be here too. So how do we have succession plans for our homes, for our leadership, for our businesses are the three primary areas I think about. So yes, you've always changed. Talk to the people who thought it changed. Like there's a book called Kids These Days who, I can't remember the author's name, but it is about how the current generation, older generation always disparages the younger. Like, oh, these kids are so selfish and entitled. Well, baby boomers, you were called that too, right? When you were kids, and now we're just, we need to stop that kind of stuff and just respect people for who they are. Because you have people making a choice to invest their lives in your town. And maybe we should give them a little bit of credit. So I'll just stop talking about that. How do you make an insight to make our communities better? To work with the army of the willing, like find things that you have control over. One of my favorite lines is, today people know more and more about which they have less and less control. Like, how do you actually find out about things going on locally? You have to work at that. And so find events. So we've got plans for welcoming communities or newcomer suppers. How do you engage people? And it's not like, oh, James, you're new in town. Are you ready to, sit on the EDA board? Like, don't ask that. It better be like, hey, we're flipping burgers for the firemen on Friday. Do you want to help us out? That's a small engagement. So this is all very community development oriented stuff, on the ground oriented stuff. But I would argue it's much bigger. When you talk about changing perspective, what's the next step is really, truly, like I worked with the foundation world for a long time. And it was interesting to see how they, again, if you view rural as dying, then all you do is have all these programs to help the poor dying towns. And literally communities are defining themselves by what we fund. And if all you fund is problems, then communities are like, we're just a big problem. And we have copy and paste language for our problems. So that for me is the path forward. If you have a negative narrative, you have a whole different set of strategies than if you don't. So I just ask you to examine community goals, visioning that you do to ensure that the narrative does reflect where your community is and not a singular narrative of a group of 3 people who hate your town today. Stop. I talk about apartment buildings versus single family. It seems like apartments get more people. Yeah, hard to get them built. It's all hard to build. Really, community to community is very, very variable right now. So again, I just talk about build the army of the willing. Like whatever you do is not going to be wrong at this point because building almost any housing is going to get filled up. We are seeing a lot more trends demographically around multifamily homes, multi-generational homes. When I say multi-gen, we're actually returning to multi-generational housing. We used to be that way in the early 1900s, and it wasn't until the 1940s and 50s, the whole idea that I'm successful when I live by myself with my wife and my kids in the nuclear household. It's so 1950s. Well, we're getting out of that again. So now, do we even allow for multifamily, generational families to live together in some of our housing stocks? So these are part of the issues too, is just knowing what type of housing needs to get built. So, but again, for me, a lot of it is right now we have, especially with around workforce, is we've watched over the past 15 years, a large number of retirees in our small towns just stay in their home. But then if I'm an employer and I just watched 3 of my employees retire in the past 2 years, and they just stayed in their homes, I can't even replace their labor because there's nowhere for them to live. So this is truly inhibiting all of these other factors across our community. So I'll just stop talking about that. I want to respect everybody's answers here. So funding, encourage people to fund things besides what's traditional and think of the future. I don't know. I don't know. Sometimes policy questions are all mystery for me. So like that's a whole different world I don't typically work in. But for me, it is all about like, when you bring together people to interact in a community around a meal and you start to envisioning, like generally people are sharing stories about what they like and what they need and in a positive way. It's never a negative thing to bring people together. So I just, bring people to interact. Like if they're going to fund something, fund interaction in a safe space for people. And I will say, we do say that you can offer newcomer suppers, and the newcomer supper, it's only for the newcomers. It's not for all the existing people to like gawk at all the new people. It is only for the newcomers. And the number one outcome out of these newcomer suppers is newcomers saying, oh, I can't believe I'm not the only one. It is super alienating moving to a rural community when you don't know anyone and when you're part of that 3 out of 4 households that are not from there. So there's social capital work to be done there. Is that an important point for me? The question of multifamily enables grandparents to live. Yeah, and ADUs. I mean, all of these things, multifamily, multi-generational, just what do we allow or disallow on our parcels in our communities? So I don't have a lot of experience in housing. I just know that there are a lot of homes being occupied by a group that normally would have moved out and normally would have had other people moving in. And it leads to all these questions around housing. I'm not a housing person, I'm a data person. So that's the extent of my expertise. But we've got about 2 minutes here. I want to respect everybody's time and really just say thank you so much for tuning in today and just providing an opportunity for me to share my research.
Once again, thank you, Ben, and thank you for everyone who attended. And once again, this information will be posted at the CTS's parent website. So thank you once again.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.